Good evening, my friends. Let me just get this screen set up for myself so I can monitor and make sure we are indeed broadcasting. And this is why I do this. I believe we are, but just want to make sure. Very good. So big thanks to Erez Safar for organizing the Light of the Infinite Festival and this Tikkun HaKlali, a concept originated, got to be by Rabbi Nachman. So I wanted to share a story with you all that has a personal connection for me. And it started with my first journey to Uman, which was a few years before COVID. And for those who, probably a lot of people who are watching this festival have been there, but for those who are not familiar, there's this massive celebration every Rosh Hashanah in the town of Uman in Ukraine. And the reason we go there is because that is the burial place of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. And he has a very devoted following in the world, not only among Breslovers, who are actual Hasidim of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, but also lots of other people, who really value the beautiful, beautiful teachings of Rabbi Nachman. And he said that if you come by me for Rosh Hashanah, that makes you my chassid. And even if you end up in Gehenna, the difficult place for purifying one's soul after you leave this life, he will come and pluck you out of Gehenna by your payas, right? By your side locks. And so it was very difficult to go to Uman in Ukraine during the years of the USSR, the Soviet Union. But once the wall came down, it has become an annual pilgrimage that has grown and grown. There was some interruption for COVID. There's some interruption now for the war in Ukraine. But still, many people managed to go even during COVID and even during the war that's going on there now, perhaps not in quite as high numbers as before COVID. So when I was there, there were, estimates vary, but there was at least 50,000 guys there. It's almost all men who go, and maybe as high as 80,000. Now, I told my dad that I was going on this trip to Ukraine, and he said, we're from Ukraine. Now, I was born in Chile. My father was born in Chile. His father was born in Chile. But my great-grandfather came from Ukraine and ended up in South America, like many Eastern European Jews did. And so I said, Dad, I know we're from Ukraine. We're from Odessa. And he said, no, we're not from Odessa. Our family came out through Odessa, and this ancestor of ours, my great-grandfather, lived in Odessa for a while before living Ukraine. But actually, our shtetl, right, our little town in Ukraine that we're from, my father said is called Chichelnitsky. So I get out my Google Maps, I start looking around, Chichelnitsky. There's no Chichelnitsky, but there's Chichelnik. And I figured, okay, so that must be the Russian name or Ukrainian name of a shtetl that we refer to by its Yiddish name. And so I made a plan to go with my friends. And so it's my good friend Moshe Storch, who's a Breslover and a fantastic singer and such a holy guy. And he was sort of my guide going to Uman because he had been many times. And we had everyone who goes to Uman will tell you it's a phenomenal Rosh Hashanah. The prayer, the davening on Rosh Hashanah itself, was with 300 guys in a minyan called Nakuda Tova, with a lot of sort of very spirited Karl Bach style singing. And we started at 8:30 in the morning and finished at 5 o'clock in the evening. And it seemed a little rushed. It was that elevated. Sometimes Uman is referred to as the Jewish Burning Man, which is a kind of weird comparison, but it's a very elevated, fairly life-changing experience. I highly recommend you go to Uman if you get the chance. At any rate, the days of Uman ended, and we were able to find a local driver who took Moshe and me and two other guys who had become my friends during that week in Uman and were curious. And very often before or after Uman, people will stop at other sort of well-known cities like Medjugorje, which is where the Baal Shem Tov is buried, or Breslov, where Rebbe Nachman was from, Berdichev, right, where the famous Berdichever Rebbe had his seat. And so you visit these other places, visit the Kavarim, the burial places of these tzaddikim, of these famous righteous rabbis. And it's kind of, graveside tourism, as it were. But no one was familiar with Chichelnik. Right? Nobody who's on that tour of going to Uman and then visiting some of these other famous towns that other Rebbes were from and that, Hasidic communities were from, no one had ever heard of Chichelnik. But hey, it's on Google Maps. So our Ukrainian driver was able to navigate and get us there. I think it was about a 2-hour ride from Uman. And when we got there, it had no visitors center, okay? Uman has so many pilgrims come, not only during Rosh Hashanah, but all year people will go to visit Rabbi Nachman's grave. Likewise for the Berdichever, who has kind of a small visitor center inside of a cemetery. Medjugorje, where the Baal Shem Tov is buried, and Reb Baruch and certain other Rebbes has a really elaborate, kind of visitor infrastructure. Chichelnik has none of that. But we were able to find, the Jewish cemetery. So, there's a lot of Jewish cemeteries in Ukraine. These communities are decimated. The only people who go to these cemeteries basically now are tourists like us. And the locals, what can I say? When, my mother was a Hungarian Holocaust survivor. Her mother carried her as an infant through the camps. When you would hear the Hungarian survivors talk about the non-Jews in Hungary, they would say things like, oh, the Hungarians were the worst, And Polish survivors would say, oh, the Polish non-Jews were the worst. They hated us and persecuted us so bad. But lots of folks will say that the Ukrainians were the worst in terms of abusing the Jews and, creating pogroms to kill and destroy, etc. At any rate, this Jewish cemetery, that had been sort of unused in this town of Chichelnik for many years, it had been desecrated many times. Many of the stones were knocked over, broken, graffitied, missing, etc. But many of the stones were still there. And we felt like, wow, nobody's visited these graves in so long. And it's just very moving for us. And we actually found a more modern part of the cemetery where we found a grave with the name Litvak on it. So indeed, this was, a place that my ancestors probably lived. I mean, there's other Litvaks in the world, but how many Litvaks lived in this small town of Chichelnik? So it's probably an ancestor of mine named Yosef Litvak. And so it was very moving just to be walking among the graves. And we really kind of got into a meditative state and sort of just bore witness to the people who had lived there, to the community that had existed in that town. And after about 2 hours of being there, and since there was nothing else to see in Chichelnik, just, kind of modern farm town and no Jewish community at all, it was time to leave. But as we were, walking toward the exit of the cemetery, there was a little concrete building, the kind of building that made you think that, that's where their groundskeeper would keep his lawnmower, that kind of a building. But there was a sign on it that we had not noticed earlier with Hebrew on it and a phone number. And it said to open the Ohel, call this number. Now in Ohel, if you've ever been to the Rebbe's Ohel, in Montefiore Cemetery in New York, where the Leibowitz Rebbe is buried, an Ohel is a place where a prominent, righteous Rebbe type of person is buried. So we realized that, some prominent person is buried here. We called the number. A few minutes later, a neighboring farmer walked up. He opened the door for us. We walked in, and what we found was, I believe, 3 generations of the Savrunner Rebbe. All right, so the earliest Savronner Rebbe, I believe his name was Moshe Tzvi of Savron, and his son and his grandson were all buried in this building. On the inside was quite nice. It was well maintained. And I didn't know about them, but everyone's heard of Chabad, let's say, and a lot of people have heard of Satmar, maybe Belz and Bobo, but there are many Hasidic dynasties, and there still is Savronner Hasidim who have a community, I believe, in Israel. And so this was the first Savronner Rebbe. I was like, oh wow, that's interesting. And we paid our respects, and there was a book there of some of his teachings, and we read some of that in his name, and like I said, really interesting. We got in the car and started, continuing our pilgrimage. We were on our way to Medjugorje to visit the grave of the Baal Shem Tov. Meanwhile, because I was going to visit Rebbe Nachman for my first time, when I went to Uman that year, I was reading a book called Through Fire and Water by Chaim Kramer, who I believe is a speaker in this festival as well, an incredibly distinguished rabbi who's done so much amazing research, and he publishes so much in Breslov Research Institute. And this book was a biography of Reb Nosson. Now, Rebbe Nachman, sort of like, Hasidim need a Rebbe, right? Now in Chabad, you have that Chabad Hasidim, the followers of Chabad, their Rebbe is dead because the Leibowitzer Rebbe died and no successor was appointed. But until that happened, they had a living Rebbe. They always had a living Rebbe. And almost all the Hasidic sects have living Rebbes that they attach themselves to. Breslovers have been attached to Rebbe Nachman, even though he died, in the early 1800s. And he died at a young age. And even though his teachings are just absolutely magnificent, and I really recommend that you read Outpouring of the Soul, which is a very short book, or, Likutei Moharan, the Kitzer Likutei Moharan. I mean, just read teachings of Rebbe Nachman. But really, we wouldn't have all these teachings. We wouldn't know so much of what Rebbe Nachman stood for if it wasn't for his primary disciple, Reb Nosson. Right? So it was Reb Nosson, who was a guy who was destined to be a great Talmudic scholar in the kind of Litvak tradition, go to Vilna, be a great Talmud Chacham. But he kind of rejected, what his family expected him to do when he realized that Rebbe Nachman was, had the truth in his hands. And even though it cost him tremendous opportunities, he could have really written his own ticket and been both a wealthy businessman and a very learned scholar. He just would have had a lot of things going for him, but he gave it all up. To first, attach himself to Rebbe Nachman, and then even after Rebbe Nachman died, to publish, to write down and publish all of the teachings and all of the thinking and philosophy of Rebbe Nachman. Now, in the early days of the Breslover movement, of the people, the Hasidim attached to Rebbe Nachman, there were other Hasidic groups already. Rebbe Nachman was a great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic Judaism. And so by the time he came along, there were already, somewhat established, it hadn't been around for that long, but somewhat established Hasidic movements. And one of the biggest and certainly most influential was this Savronner Rebbe and his followers. So he had thousands of followers. And what Hasidic Judaism represented, a somewhat new movement in the history of Judaism, which was, after all, is thousands of years old, and Hasidic Judaism is only a couple hundred years old. And at this stage, it was, 30, 40, 50 years it had been going. And so the Hasidim had to fight battles against the kind of Talmudic-oriented, by the book. The more learned you are, the more respectable you are, but the simple people don't count for quite as much. And the Hasidim said, you have to be very learned, but God loves the prayers of simple people. And whether you're simple or learned, God wants you to pray with all your heart and devotion, even ecstatic prayer, right? They were sort of like the hippie radicals of the Jewish world. But just as hippies, are now 50 years into the idea of hippies, they're a little bit more established. That's kind of the stage we're at when we're talking about the 1830s. And the Savrana Rebbe had a real problem with these Breslover upstarts. First of all, they're attached to a Rebbe who's dead. And whoever heard of that? That doesn't make any sense. They're worshiping this man as if he's some kind of deity, and that's heretical, and he was against it. Moreover, they were so spiritually inclined, they didn't really care whether they were making money, they weren't pursuing anything material. They were just, so devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Nachman and to living a beautiful and spiritual and elevated life. And the Savrunner, with sincerity, it wasn't due to some kind of corruption or desire for power, but he really believed that this was a heretical movement that needed to be stamped out. And he issued various decrees, like even that you could punch a Breslover, you can turn a Breslover over to the authorities, anything to kill this nascent Breslover movement, he was ready to do. And no matter how much pressure he put on the Breslovers, and because he was influential and had some very wealthy people in his movement, was able to get the ear of the Russian authorities, the local governors, etc., who paid obeisance to the Tsar, in the capital of Russia. But here in this Ukraine area, there were the local governors. And the Savrunner was able to wield influence and make life super difficult for Reb Nosson and for this young Breslov movement. But no matter what he did, no matter how hard he tried to stamp it out, the Breslovers wouldn't go away. And so finally, the Savrunner said, all right, we got to get rid of Reb Nosson. It's all about Reb Nosson. He's the one publishing Rabbi Nachman's works now that Nachman is dead. We got to stop Reb Nosson. The solution is have him exiled to Siberia. And so the Savrunner Rebbe has a plan. He's going to go visit the governor, the regional governor in the town of Kamenetz. And he's going to say to him, listen, this new religion that these Breslovers are inventing, it's seditious. It leads people to only care about spirituality and not do work and support themselves. And therefore, it's a danger to the government. And you got to get rid of this guy. And it's even possible, I think I heard it somewhere else, not in Rabbi Kramer's book, that he was going to offer a big bribe to that governor just to get rid of Reb Nosson. So he's on his way to Kamenetz to do that. Word gets back to Reb Nosson, who's already been exiled from Breslov. He has to live in some other place. He can't get to Uman on Rosh Hashanah because of all the pressure, etc. It's been very difficult for him. And now word comes to him that the Savrunner Rebbe is on his way to Kamenetz to see the governor, and everybody knows it's in order to get Reb Nosson exiled to Siberia, which is like a death sentence. Reb Nosson starts praying, almost like he's in a trance. His followers are waiting to see what's going to happen. He comes out of it and he says, the Savrunner will not reach Kamenetz for Shabbos. That's what he says. He will not get there in time for Shabbos. Because the Savrunner was planning to spend Shabbos by the home of his wealthiest, most influential follower in the town of Kamenetz, and then with that follower, they were going to go together to see the governor and get this edict published to exile Reb Nosson to Siberia. But when Reb Nosson comes out of this trance, he says the Savrunner will not get to Kamenetz by Shabbos. Cut to on the road, right? Like a movie, we cut to the Savrunner, who's a very august, regal type of Rebbe, always beautifully dressed, always traveling with a court, with many followers. So imagine there are a couple of wagons with all their supplies, the court, the disciples of the Savrunner on the road, and out of a clear blue sky, clouds are suddenly forming, and a storm begins. and the roads become so muddy that they're impassable, and he's not going to get to Kamenetz before Shabbos. So they're going to have to stop at a town, which is about 40 miles away from Kamenetz, called Litnivitz. Right? Small town called Litnivitz. Now, there's a Jewish community in Litnivitz, and they're overjoyed that somebody as prominent and august and revered as the Savrana Rebbe is going to spend Shabbos with them. Wonderful. There's 2 rabbis in this little town, and they're just, they roll out the red carpet for the Savrana. They put him up in the nicest house in the town. Not as nice as what the Savraners used to, but hey, they're doing their best to host him. They have a beautiful Shabbos. And by Saturday afternoon, they tell the Savrana, it's not an accident that you were sent here and that you had to stop in our town when you were really on your way to Kamenetz, because we have a huge problem here. And in that town of Litnivitz, there was a known informer. Now, this was a Jew who was living as a pious Jew, a frum, Orthodox, Hasidic Jew, but who was corrupt and was taking money from the Tsar's army to inform the Tsar's army which Jewish families were hiding their sons from conscription into that army. Because when you got drafted into the Tsar's army, it wasn't for 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. It was for 25 years. And if you're a Jew, no way are they going to allow you to eat kosher food, observe Shabbos, etc. It's like a death sentence for a religious Jew to be taken into that army. So the families would hide their sons. And this informer would rat out his fellow Jews so that their children would be taken into that army. It was such a dangerous and awful thing to do that the community had sort of brought these charges against the informer to the Beis Din, to the local rabbinic court, and they sentenced him to die. But they can't carry out such a serious sentence on the authority of 2 local rabbis. They needed a 3rd rabbi, first of all, and they needed a 3rd rabbi with some heft in the Jewish world. And suddenly the Savrana Rebbe is dropped into their lap, spending Shabbos with them, and they explain to him how dangerous this informer is. And the Savrana understands, and he sympathizes with them, but he also knows that it'll be his signature that really authorizes the death sentence of an informer of the Tsar's army. Very dangerous thing to do. And so he says no. And the people say to him, aren't you going to Kamenetz to get rid of Reb Nosson and have him sent to Siberia? Do you have enough money in case you need to bribe the governor to make that happen? Because it's worth everything to us. And we'll give you this bag of money if you'll give it to the government, which may come in handy for you if you will sign the writ of execution for this informer. And the Savrana Rebbe's hatred for Reb Nosson was so great that it overcame his caution in the face of such a politically dangerous thing to do, and he signed. Now, the way that they're going to execute this informer is to toss him into the furnace underneath the bathhouse. And so they said, okay, as soon as Shabbos ends, we'll fire it up. But the attendant of the bathhouse said, I'm only going to do this if the Savrana is there. And so the Savrana said, okay. And the Savrana was present when they brought this informer. He didn't know why he was coming. Somebody said, the Savrana wants to see you. Wants to see me? Why does he want to see me? I don't know. Come. They brought him. They tied him up, blindfolded him, and they threw him in the furnace, which was piping hot, and he was just killed instantly. No body, right? No evidence. Savrana and his disciples get back on their wagons. Boom, Saturday night, they head off for Kamenetz. When they get to Kamenetz, the person that the Savrana was supposed to stay with over Shabbos has had to leave town for a quick business trip. So the Savrana can't get in to see the governor with his friend, the prominent guy in Kamenetz, until Wednesday. During those days when he's waiting to see the governor, the family of the informer realized that that man was gone, and they quickly asked around and found out what happened, and then traveled to Kamenetz and filed a police report that on the word of this Savrunner Rebbe, their family member had been executed in an extrajudicial proceeding. Extrajudicial meaning not in the Russian system, but only in their Jewish system. And when word of that got to the governor, he was furious. Who does this Savrunner think he is? He thinks he's the law and that he's coming to me and he's going to get rid of one of my informers. And why is he coming to see me? Because he wants to get rid of some other guy in his community? I'll show him. And when word of this got to the Savrunner, he realized that he was a wanted man. And that the last place he could go is to go see that governor to try to, have Reb Nosson sent to Siberia. If he got in to see that governor, he would be sent to Siberia at best, if not executed on the spot. And so the Savrunner went into hiding. And he couldn't return to Savron. The Savrunner Rebbe's from Savron, but he couldn't return there because he was a wanted man. The pressure on Reb Nosson ended. That was it. From then on, Reb Nosson was free. There was definitely some people who were against the Breslovers, but not like the Savrunner had been. And so the movement, the Breslov movement, continued to grow and flourish. And the Savrunner Rebbe, who went into hiding, ended up in a small, out-of-the-way town called Chichelnik. And so, my friends, what happened as a result of this feud, this bitter battle, the Savrunner trying to shut down Reb Nosson and this burgeoning Breslov movement? 200 years later, Moshe Storch and I and our two friends and 80,000 other guys celebrated Rosh Hashanah with Rebbe Nachman and the great Breslover movement. And the Savrunner ended up buried in Chichelnik. He formed a little community there, and that's why his son, who was the next Rebbe, and his grandson, the next Rebbe, are buried there. But, who spent Rosh Hashanah with them? Nobody. And they just got 4 visitors a few days later. Now, the coda of the story, which is nice, is that eventually the Savrunners moved to Israel. And I'm told that today there's a Savrunner Rebbe. And he's a very good friend of the Breslov community because, as we've learned in the past year, the last thing that the Jewish world can afford, that the Jewish community, the community of Israel, the last thing we can afford is a terrible division amongst ourselves where we're going to go and try to bring in outsiders to get rid of one part or another of our community. We must be a unified front in this world. The Achdus, the unity of the Jewish people, is what makes us strong. And as we've seen, last year in Israel was the most divided that the modern state of Israel has been, and all the problems that were going there. But after October 7th, we are the most unified that we have ever been. Thank God. And when we are unified and when we are standing strong and when we're devoted to Torah and to our sages and to our teachers and when we respect differences of opinion amongst ourselves, but we continue our love of Am Yisrael, of the nation of Israel, then nothing can conquer us in this world. I want to thank you for tuning in during this Light of the Infinite Festival. And I'm going to see, maybe have a couple of minutes to take a question if my wife Nina has passed me any. But otherwise, I believe that a half hour is where we wanted to end up. Is this going to load for me? Are there any questions? Doesn't seem to be questions that she's passed to me. So that's what I've got. And I hope you enjoyed that story. And if you ever get a chance to go to Uman and visit Rebbe Nachman's grave, it's a great visit, a very spiritual, uplifting thing. It's mostly for men at Rosh Hashanah, but there's also kind of women's weekends. Hanukkah is also big in Uman. And if you ever want to visit Chichelnik and pay your respects to the Savrunner Rebbe, who, after all, was a thorn in the side of the Breslovers, but I believe he was coming from a heartfelt place because he was worried about this sort of newfangled, Hasidic Judaism without a Rebbe. It was a dispute for the sake of Torah and for the nation, I would hope. And may his memory, and both their memories of these Rebbes and Rabbi Nosson as well, may their memories all be for a blessing, and may we all continue to rise in knowledge and wisdom and love of each other, and may there be peace in Israel, in this world, and in the world above. And we say Amen.